Okay, welcome everyone, and thanks for being here. My name is Mary Taylor, and I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. I'd like to first acknowledge that the CPCP and the CUNY Graduate Center are located on the ancestral land of the Lenape peoples, who continue to live here and take care of the land. The CPCP has a tradition of sparking our annual seminar theme with our May conference. Last year, we were planning our conference on the agrarian question when the lockdown began in New York. This year, after a year relating on Zoom, we decided to package our conference succinctly for this medium as a conversation between our director, Ruthie Gilmore, and our visiting scholar, Mendonça. This event comes after we have critically reflected on the agrarian question in our seminar for over the past year. We approached the topic from many angles, beginning with historical materialist approaches to the agrarian question and to the neoliberal era, touching on questions of how we can understand imperialism, analyzing the relationship of aesthetics to national, imperial, and revolutionary politics, and examining the role of financial capital, indeed our own pension funds, in land grabbing. We covered many places in the world, gained a global picture through nuanced attention to local situations and international and transnational processes. Seminar members shared their work on migrant farm worker organizing in the US, Syrian refugee farm workers at the Lebanese-Syrian border, the role of the import of cheap food in food production in Puerto Rico, the uneven distribution of ecological labor and its relationship to land and other resources in a water catchment in Tanzania. Members also shared on the processes leading to the adoption of the 2018 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People in Rural Areas, the relationship of land disputes to sexual assault on Dalit women in Haryana, India, and the feminization of agrarian labor in Lithuania. We discussed the rise of the right and its relationship to the conditions of rural people, and what remembering interwar agrarian populism can tell us about the work of populism and anti-populism in post-socialist Hungary. I'm going to hand over the mic to my colleague, Mythri Prasad Alayama, the postdoctoral researcher at the CPCP, to continue with this introduction. Mythri.
Thank you, Mary, for that overview of the work at CPCP in the past year. Mine is going to be more of a record of feelings. It was the second year of my postdoctoral fellowship and one that was steeped in the pandemic disconnect. The Wednesday seminar provided a way to anchor my wayward, anxious thoughts in the here and now of an intellectual community. What stands out for me in our seminar, as Mary has pointed out, is the global, the international, and the planetary that are in dialogue with local contexts and regional formations. I believe the agrarian question comes to us not just as a history of theory, but also as a history of doing politics, inspiring us to combine dialectically questions of social relations with questions of historical consciousness. It nudges us to track changes and transformations, but also wants us to be attentive to what remains from the past and its imprints on our actions. Following this vein, we almost slipped into a conversation on fascism in the last few weeks of the seminar. It was not accidental though, as we are very much aware of the connections between the agrarian and the populist. I feel I'm still processing those conversations, but what I take away as we struggle in India against a regime that does not care as people die of lack of basic healthcare is one thing. That is, valuing life and protecting life is a political project. When we practice it collectively, as the oxygen langas of Sikhs in Delhi, it shakes governments, especially the ones who don't care and who don't value life. And happy birthday to Karl Marx, and congratulations for being alive and kicking. I look forward to today's conversation between Professor Ruthie Gilmore and Dr. Mendonça very much. And now I'll turn things over to our Associate Director, Dr. Peter Hitchcock. Over to Peter.
Thank you, Mythri. So formal. Yes, my name is Peter Hitchcock, the Associate Director of the Center for Place, Culture and Politics. And my job is principally to introduce our distinguished speakers and interlocutors this morning, or whatever part of the day you're in where you are. First of all, though, I'd like to thank the Department of Anthropology and the Center for Humanities for co-sponsoring this event. It means a lot to us that we get this kind of support, especially under conditions of continuing actual existing austerity within higher education. I'd also like to thank Mary Taylor for her work as facilitator extraordinaire, and all the while doing her own research while she's keeping the center together. Mythri deserves my thanks and deep appreciation for managing to do her research under these extreme conditions. And as she just mentioned, she's currently located in India, which, as you know, over the past few weeks has seen a deepening of the crisis in addition to the crisis called Modi. Before I get to introducing our speakers, I'd also like to thank the members of our seminar this year, who, like everyone else, have worked under extraordinary conditions in contributing to the conversations of the center. Although I have this fancy title, Associate Director, for the most part in listening to their research and responding to their research, I have been more like the pupil, and happy to be so. It's always a great experience for me to learn so much in the intellectual engagement that we foster within the seminar of the Center for Place, Culture and Politics. One last thing before the introductions. Both of our speakers will entertain questions, but for logistical reasons, could you please post those questions into the chat, and then I will get to them as best I can in the order in which they're received. And that way, I hope we'll get as many questions in as possible during this session. Okay. Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, or AKA Ruthie, as I know her, my friend and colleague, is director of the Center for Place, Culture and Politics, and she teaches in Earth and Environmental Sciences, American Studies, and Environmental Psychology at the CUNY GC. Ruthie is author of the award-winning Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California. And her forthcoming books include Change Everything for Haymarket Press, Abolition Geography for Verso, and Ruthie is a busy subthug. She has co-edited a book with Paul Gilroy, Stuart Hall, Selected Writings on Race and Difference, and that's coming out with Duke. The documentary Racial Capitalism with Ruth Wilson Gilmore features her internationalist political work, and I think that's available on the Antipode online site. She has co-founded many grassroots organizations, including the California Prison Moratorium Project, Critical Resistance, and the Central California Environmental Justice Network. Ruthie has lectured all over the world, both in person and in rectangles. And among her most recent honors is the Lanham Foundation Cultural Freedom Prize of 2020. And she was a co-recipient of that award with Angela Davis and Mike Davis. Dr. Maria Luisa Mendonça, AKA Misa, has a PhD in human geography from the Department of Philosophy, Literature, and Social Sciences at the University of Sao Paulo, and is currently a research scholar at the Center for Place, Culture and Politics, and we are very lucky to have her. Her research includes history and the political economy of agriculture, food, land, and water systems, and geopolitical processes of resistance by rural social movements in Brazil and globally. Her book, Political Economy of Agribusiness, demonstrates the central role of the food system in international relations as a result of a dialectical movement of economic crisis and expansion in connection with critical areas such as trade agreements, financial markets, environmental justice, and transnational activism. Two words that jump out at me in that sentence are activism and dialectical activism. Her current research project anticipated a trend in financial capital to migrate to farmland markets in the global South, especially after the subprime crisis in the US real estate market in 07-08. This research on financial markets and land speculation includes building an international network of scholars and social movements throughout Latin America, North America, and Europe. She's published her work in journals, in public educational reports, and in journalistic outlets. Her experience includes documentary filmmaking, investigative journalism, and community-based research. She has taught international political economy at University of Rio de Janeiro and at the Center for Advanced Research Fundação Getúlio Vargas, apologies for my pronunciation, and was a visiting scholar at Cornell University. Mendonça is a co-founder of the World Social Forum, yes, that one, and has served in expert meetings on the right to food for UN Women, the Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, and the United Nations Human Rights Commission. She is the founder of Rede Social de Justiça y Delitos Humanos, apologies for my pronunciation again, the Network for Social Justice and Human Rights in Brazil, and the editor of the book, Human Rights in Brazil, which is published annually since the year 2000. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming in any way you can our two distinguished speakers. Thank you.
Woohoo! Well, thank you, Mary and Mythri and Peter, Doctor, for your lovely introductions to what we've been up to for the year, as well as to the two of us. And for all of you who have taken time out of your busy morning, afternoon, or evening, thank you for joining us. I look forward to our discussion. When we first dreamed up this one event conference, which should have just been closing event, I proposed that we invite Myza to give us a closing keynote speech. And Myza said, oh, I'm only going to do it, Ruthie, if you'll talk with me. So I'm going to trick Myza into giving a closing keynote speech by asking her questions, and you all can piece together that closing keynote from the answer. Myza and I have been friends for, oh my goodness, 9 years, a long time, ever since we met in New York. Very close friends, colleagues, comrades. I learn from Myza every single day, and it's a joy to have this time to be in dialogue with her. So the way we'll proceed is I'll ask Myza some questions and she'll respond, and we'll probably go back and forth over some of the topics that we touch on. And after maybe about 50 minutes or so, we'll open up to questions from the audience, this great, beautiful, gorgeous, still growing audience. So Myza, let's start with a little background. What were some of the principal social movements you worked with as a journalist, as a documentary filmmaker, as an organizer, sort of up through you being a co-founder of the World Social Forum? So just give us a broad sense of that.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I want to say that CPCP is more than a wonderful academic space. It's a home for me, and it's a community with wonderful friends. So very happy to be here. Yes, when I was a documentary filmmaker, I was doing work basically documenting social movements in Brazil and internationally. But I had a special relation until today for many years with rural social movements in Brazil, such as the MST, the Movimento Sem Terra, the landless workers movement and indigenous movements in Brazil. Because land, we are talking about the agrarian question today, and in Brazil, understanding land, by understanding land, we understand economic, social, and environmental justice, how we can build that in a country where Brazil is one of the few countries in the world that never had a massive agrarian reform, and it has one of the largest land concentrations in the world. And that is the root of social and economic inequalities in urban areas as well. And the land also has an important role in terms of who we are as a country. Since colonial times, Brazil has this role internationally of exporting commodities, expanding plantations to export agricultural commodities to the rest of the world. And this remains today. This is mainly the role. Brazil has this role. And so, while we think of agribusiness as playing a role in development, just reproduces this neo-colonial relations, economic relations. So, and rural social movements then are at the center of the main disputes, geopolitical disputes for natural resources. So they play a very important role. When we talk about rural social movements, we're not talking about communities far away over there. They're at the center of political disputes for mining, for water, for land. So these are key issues. And the MST and other rural social movements have a very sophisticated analysis. I think this is important also to understand. Although they are at the forefront of these disputes in rural areas, they have a very sophisticated analysis, and they build knowledge on political economy, on philosophy, on history, and they also build knowledge on, for example, how to build an educational system that can be transformative, how to transform gender relations within rural movements and in rural areas, in rural communities, how women and youth have a central role, for example, in leadership and organizing, how to build ecological food production. And also, although they are rooted in local communities, they also have built Via Campesina, which is a very large network of rural social movements, a very diverse network that is present in 70 countries, that also has a very sophisticated perspective. And one of the main slogans is globalize the struggle, globalize hope. So, there are so many different dimensions of rural social movements in Brazil. And I think that's very important for us to understand historical and current issues that are central, to every debate today.
Thanks. Thank you for that fantastic introduction, Mythri. So following on where you just left off, I mean, you told us a little bit about the MST, which we're going to come back to later on in our discussion. And you also mentioned Via Campesina and other international solidarities that have been growing over quite some time. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the kinds of solidarities that, for example, the World Social Forum was supposed to enable. So we know that globalization was itself a response, however erratic, however uncentralized, a controlled response to anti-colonial, to worker, to revolutionary, to internationalist movements throughout the long middle of the long 20th century. So it's not like globalization just sprung out of nowhere. It sprung in many ways out of or through the dialectics of opposition to exploitation and to landlessness. So could you talk maybe a little bit about the geographies of global struggle, building on what you've already said, and some of the internationalist organizations and movements that came together as the World Social Forum to enable, again, certain kinds of dialogue that could interrupt slippages that happen a lot, that could help to resolve conflicts, and also could take head on some kind of control of antagonisms or splintering global solidarities, especially after 1989.
Yes, the World Social Forum was a response to those years of neoliberalism that, of course, neoliberalism is still here. But the first Social Forum was in 2000. And for me, one important point is that the World Social Forum was not an event, it was a process. We built that as a process of organizing a space for different groups to come together and to build common strategies among different sectors. For example, at that time, we had international organizing among unions, environmental groups, women's movements, but the World Social Forum brought different movements together. So, you know, we had artists, we had student movements, peasant movements, indigenous, the Black movement, in dialogue with each other. And in addition to building strategies for mobilization, also it was a space to build proposals for transformative change. How do we, you know, look at this? At that time, you know, neoliberalism had this idea, the ideology was that that was the end of history. So considering that context, how can we transform that? How can we look at that at the current context and think of ways for transformation? And also another important point was that the role of multinational institutions and multinational corporations, multilateral institutions such as the WTO, IMF, the World Bank, and then also several trade agreements such as the FTA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, that was negotiated at that time. And, you know, in the 90s, we saw huge protests in relation to that. For example, in Seattle, in Washington, DC, in Europe. But usually, you know, although there was a lot of debate and discussion, there was also severe repression. So usually the image we would see in the media was, you know, huge protests and police repression as well. So by bringing those movements to the global South, you know, we started the World Social Forum in Brazil. We created a space that was kind of, we wanted to create kind of a safe space for those movements to put forward what, you know, their vision for transformation. And the first year in 2000, we expected about 4,000 people, and then 20,000 people showed up at the forum. And then the second year we had 60,000 people. And then the third year we had 100,000 people. So then at that point we realized that, you know, what we were creating was a space and a method. So it was important to multiply that all over the world. So we also had, you know, different types of events and processes in different countries. we had regional forums, we had local thematic events. So, but there was, one of the tensions was how to combine more fluid social movements. For example, the student movements that were, movements that were responding to urgent demands with more long-term institutional type of organizing that could sustain that process over time. So, but that was definitely, it was definitely a moment where I think, there was a need and a demand for that type of process. And I was happy to be part of that.
Could I ask you to say a few more words about that last image you left us with? You talked about more fluid movements and gave us an example, student movements. And then more, I think you used the word institutional movements. We could say labor unions as an example of that. So would you reflect a little bit on how, in the context of the World Social Forum, those different kinds of movements might have, or actually did in fact, interact and learn from each other?
Yeah, I think that was important because, again, I think the World Social Forum was the first space that allowed, the interaction of different types of movements in terms of thematics, in terms of also approaches to organizing. And one thing that I think we learned, and also, some organizations that have, let's say, a more traditional way of organizing that is, they're important to sustain movements over time. But I think one thing that I learned is that nothing is spontaneous. When we see people reacting, like we're seeing huge mobilizations in Colombia right now, and a lot of repression. We saw, huge protests by farmers in India also. So certain things that suddenly appear and seem, kind of spontaneous, that is a lot of organizing on the ground. It's just that we don't know about it. So, nothing is spontaneous. Everything takes work, takes, people to organize on a daily basis on the ground. So, I think that it's important how we can be flexible and understand that, there are different ways of organizing and we can learn from each other.
Yes, you bring to mind a few different experiences that I have had or know of in the same period of global history. So one is that just as the World Social Forum planned for, I think you said for 4,000 and 20,000 people came, similarly, a couple of years before the first World Social Forum meeting, a group of people, mostly, but not exclusively, based in US political work, planned out the first Critical Resistance Conference, whose subtitle was Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex. And we planned for 500 people. And in the summer before our conference, a number of us went to the Black Radical Congress gathering in Chicago and saw thousands and thousands and thousands of people arriving. And we thought, this is going to happen with us too. And indeed, when our conference began about 7 weeks later, 3,500 people came to the very first day. So we see the need, and we see that people who are curious about organizing, as well as many, many people who've been organizing, sometimes in isolation, whether they're large or small organization, come together for these gatherings. But I'm also interested in in what you say about the various themes and intensities and urgencies for different kinds of organizations or different categories of organizers having the opportunity and feeling a little bit of a compulsion to find out what is going on with each other's forms, questions, processes, structures, campaigns. And I'll give another example. And this is not from my individual experience, but it's very telling, I think, of recent years. So the last couple of years. I was reading about a political party, not in the US or in Brazil, that recently suffered, huge defeat. And in the run-up to the election in which it suffered huge defeat, its more left-wing grouping within the party held a big convention so that people could get ready to wage the political struggle. And at the convention, people divided up into subject areas that they were concerned about. And so there was one about housing, there was one about something else, and there was one called abolition, which people tend to think is only about prisons. Most of the people who went to any of these breakout groups went to the abolition group. And so the housing people felt really aggrieved, and the people with the other groups felt really aggrieved. And one of the reasons they felt aggrieved was they thought, well, abolition is the least likely thing that this party, if it is voted into power, will put into place. Therefore, why are people wasting their time doing that? Instead of following from the pattern that I think you're sharing with us, Mysa, which is to figure out how this thing called abolition, for example, might be put into energetic operation to realize housing needs, right? So some people have asked, in fact, directly over this last year, how did it happen that the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, which is known as a kind of urbanist or place, get so interested in the agrarian question that we would put an entire year of our thinking and resources into, which is basically Zoom, into thinking about it and talking about it. And you've already given us the answer. The agrarian question is central to all of the questions that we struggle with today. It's absolutely central. And I'm also very inspired in listening to you and sharing the stories that I just shared to help people think about one of the things that we're constantly trying to achieve and promote, which is for people to break out of a categorical box that they're in and see how the dialectics of historical development require us to think and act in a variety of contexts, even if we don't lose sight of the goal that my institution exists to win wages and benefits for workers. Yes, but that can't be separated from housing. Housing being a benefit every worker needs. My institution exists to achieve access to land for landless peasants. Yes, and that means also, as you said, in the case of the MST, that means having an entire philosophical, educational, and other infrastructure to enable that kind of sustained organizing and development, small d, to take place. All right, so let's move on here, because I think I'm going now even more deeply into one of your many areas of expertise. I think of you, Mysa, as an expert on the contradictions of the great dispossession. something that our indigenous comrades will say had kicked off sometime in the Americas, sometime in 1492 and elsewhere earlier, depending on who is where. So the Great Disposition gives us the opportunity, your analysis gives us the opportunity to think very hard about how surpluses of land, of labor, of finance, and other forms of capital and state capacity arise and consolidate afresh. So what are some of the key themes we should be mindful of, in your view, when we think about confronting agribusiness? I mean, something that we've talked about a lot is the fact that on a world scale now, there are really 5 multinationals that have enormous power over the uses of land, the production of food, the commoditization of what's grown. So the big 4 are Archer-Midland Daniels, Bunge, Cargill, and what's the other one, Louis Dreyfus. And then there's a 5th one, COFCO, which is a Chinese firm that has grown enormously. We know that chemical companies, which are not identical to those, but have some overlay, are principally German, Chinese, and US, have completely, have profoundly reconfigured the biogeography of the planet, changing soil, changing seeds, changing all of that. And even recently, we've talked, Mysa and I, about the fact that these huge firms have established their own cryptocurrency relationships so they can settle their accounts between and amongst each other using cryptocurrency, so avoiding banks, which is to say becoming banks, and using cryptocurrency, which is so energy intensive that the cryptocurrency firms, the big ones, the big companies, Bitcoin and the other big ones, use as many kilowatt hours per year of electrical energy as their market capitalization in US dollars. So 100 billion and 100 billion, which then is creating environmental devastation. So could you give us some insights into your understanding of the best of powerful ways that you and your comrades have gone about confronting the might of agribusiness?
Yes, well, I have done work closely with social movements for many, many years, but at some point I thought that it would be important to do an anthropological study and really understand the political economy of agribusiness and also its ideology, how this whole thing started. What we call agribusiness started ideologically and politically after the war. It was in the 50s, the post-war, of course. Before that, we can talk about many things that happened before that, but let's start with that because that was a moment of huge expansion of this agricultural system, basically as a result of a crisis of overaccumulation in the post-war, to transfer technology, machinery, chemical weapons, and processed foods that were developed during the war to agriculture and for mass production. And that was key for US foreign policy and for the US to control the grain markets, the international grain markets. Just to give you an example, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was one of the countries that imported most grains from the US. It was Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union. So, you know, and by controlling the international grain markets, the US also was destroying local agriculture by food aid policies, you know, through food aid policies that, so it was basically dumping grains into markets and destroying local agriculture. And so that was a first moment of exporting grains, controlling the international market. Then the second moment was to export capital, mainly in the form of subsidiaries and credit to expand the so-called grain revolution system that was based on large monocropping plantations, heavy use of chemical inputs, and that was also based on Malthusian ideology that made people believe that that type of agricultural system would end hunger around the world, which we know is not true. So, and then the result of that was what we see now is a huge concentration, monopoly concentration of inputs, you know, the large corporations that control most of the production of chemical inputs and also control trade of agricultural commodities. It's important to understand that we're not talking about food. We are talking about a few commodities that are traded in future markets, in financial markets. So there is also a very important role that financial capital plays in this whole system. So my question was, what is the business of agribusiness, right? That was what I was trying to figure out. And I realized that it's actually to appropriate capital. The principal business is to appropriate capital, mainly in the form of financial capital, through credit systems, subsidies, and also to control natural resources, land, water, all those things that are important to maintain agricultural productivity. So when I started to look at, for example, you know, the agribusiness, they claim, agribusiness corporations, they claim to represent about between 30 and 40% of GDP in the US, Brazil, and other countries. But this is actually a random number because when you actually do the math, I have done this math during several decades in Brazil, the amount of unpaid debt is higher than the balance of trade for agribusiness. So they actually produce debt. So they claim that they produce soy or sugarcane or timber, but they're actually producing debt in terms of financial debt and let alone the environmental debt and destruction that they cause. So, you know, I think it's important to deconstruct in terms of, you know, using political economy, but also the ideological propaganda that was spread out all over the world to promote this, this type of monocropping plantation system and to destroy food systems around the world.
I've noticed that people are throwing into the chat questions directed to you, Mysa, for papers and publications that you might share. So I'll just announce to everybody who has joined us today that we will put some resources on the CPCP website after this is all over. It won't be today, but it will be sometime soon, so that people can read and perhaps even engage with some audio and visual materials elaborating these concerns and themes. So it's really stunning when you say that having done the calculations it's really almost just arithmetic once you realize what you're looking at. There isn't some kind of fancy algebraic anything that one needs to do. We can do it arithmetically and find that the net of all of these processes, dispossessions, displacements adds up to apparently the production of debt. That making debt then enables a certain kind of circulation of value, which is devastating for those who bear it. And that devastation, as I understand you, is one that radiates across and therefore connects scales, whether we're talking about the debt that is weighing down the shoulders of a direct producer, a farmer, or shoulders of a proletarianized peasantry because they have no access to land other than as wage labor, or people displaced from the land and settling into the planet's constantly expanding urban areas, or people displaced from livelihoods that are based in water, whether it's ocean or fresh water or adequate water for irrigation. All of that then builds up so that we can, in an abstract way, summarize all of that in terms of the calculation you did. We see the production of debt and the weight on certain national accounts and therefore these international circulations as well. And when I think about that, you know, I think, for example, you pointed to the financial, you know, the Great Recession of the end of the first decade of this century, but you also brought us from the end of the Second World War forward so that we could think across various modalities of not only capitalist production and reproduction, but also the counter forms that have withered away or been smashed. And when we think about the movement of money capital, whether the monetary unit is the US dollar or something else like the euro, we think about money capital, as it were, kind of sloshing around the planet in search of a place to stick, where it will briefly remain in order to get bigger and then slosh on, right? That's how I teach my students to think about this. So in the 80s, for example, not exclusively, petrodollars were sloshing that way. Petrodollars parked in US banks were then sloshing into Latin America, Africa, and certain parts of Asia in the form of debt, sold by 24-year-old graduates of various business schools. You know, whatever the passport the students, the graduates carried, they were strapping themselves into first-class seats to go sell debt in the South. And then in more recent years, especially in this century, we see quantitative easing, i.e. the money that the EU and the US and other governments have printed, sloshing south and doing the same kind of work. So we see this kind of cash slosh, which is quite difficult to dock. It's such a tsunami of cash looking for a place to stick for a moment in order to get bigger. And in the context of that, we also see that cash in the form of the required savings that people who live in places like the United States that don't have a centralized pension plan put away in, for example, TIAA CREF. That is, for those of you who don't know, it's a teacher's, oh God, I forgot all the words, but in any event, it is the pension plan for people who work in the not-for-profit sector. So educators, kindergarten through PhD, as well as people who work for museums and so on and so forth. They're all eligible to have money put into TIAA CREF, which is not just a savings account, it's an investment program. And TIAA CREF travels the world, sending probably equally young graduates of business schools in first-class seats to various places looking for investments so that we, who have these pension accounts, which are very fragile and vulnerable to all economic changes, will be able to draw down in our old age, which I have achieved, our deferred compensation that we didn't get in our paychecks when we signed up to work. This is the whole point. This is deferred compensation, to which we might feel appropriately we have a right because we agreed to have some pay now in the form of salary and some pay later in the form of this pension. But what this pension is doing is, not surprisingly, dispossessing people we can't see elsewhere so that we will have adequate returns so that our premature death in the US will be somewhat forestalled, even though excess deaths in the US, the richest country on the planet, are way higher than in many other parts of the world. So with that, could you talk to us a bit about the TIAA CREF struggle that you and your comrades did the research for, and what the implications are for land use and land grabbing in Brazil and elsewhere around the world?
Yes, and I think that connects with what you were saying before, Ruthie, how it's important to look at the agrarian question from different perspectives. Look at financial capital, look at different ways of organizing. And, you know, the research really led us to find this out. After the 2008 financial crisis and the collapse of the housing market in the US, we were doing research on the expansion of sugarcane monocropping for the production of ethanol and the impacts of that, and deconstructing the idea that ethanol was green energy because of the impacts of monocropping plantations of sugarcane. And especially after 2010, many sugarcane corporations that were receiving subsidies and subsidized credits. And when I talk about subsidies, we need to remember that more than 90% of all subsidies and credit go to large corporations. So small farmers really struggle, you know, to sustain. But they are the ones who produce the, you know, in the world, all food is more than 70% of food is produced by small farmers. So, and all type of agriculture needs subsidies. So we are not against subsidies. The problem is that all the credit and subsidies go to large corporations. So we defend subsidies and support for small farmers that produce food. But what we realized at that time was that sugarcane corporations in Brazil that were receiving subsidized credit were speculating with the currency, with the Brazilian currency in relation to the dollar in financial markets. And because there was devaluation of the Brazilian currency after the crisis. They lost billions of dollars in currency markets, and were not actually using the subsidies to, to invest in their own commodity systems. So many companies went bankrupt, and at that time, there was a series of mergers and joint ventures of sugarcane corporations and oil companies that started to control the ethanol market in Brazil. So one case was the merger of Cosan, which is the largest sugarcane company in Brazil, with Shell, oil Shell from the Netherlands. And they created a corporation called Raízen that was the largest producer of ethanol. And through that, we found out that Cosan had created a new type of corporation, like a rural real estate corporation called Radar, and to speculate with farmland, and that the main source of funding came from TAA Crafts. So, and at that time, we found out then that TAA had created an international corporation. At that time was called TAA Global Agriculture. Now it's called Nuveen, to speculate with farmland around the world. I try not to use the word investment, because usually investment has a positive connotation, like development has a positive connotation, but it's really about targeting farmland as a new financial asset. And like you said before, usually when we think of land in traditional economic theory, land should, traditionally, it has a function to immobilize capital, right? When you buy a house, when you buy an apartment, that capital is immobilized in that type of asset. But through the regulation process that happened during the 90s in financial markets, it's possible to use one piece of land to renegotiate that in financial markets. And that was the crisis, the subprime crisis in the housing market in the US, right? One house or one apartment was renegotiated in financial markets through derivatives several times, and that created that bubble. So, land and financial capital are completely related right now, and it's important to understand these different types of relations. And and then TAA, in addition to buying land, it was also, and it's still now, it receives funding from other pension funds in Europe and Canada, and also state pension funds in the US to speculate with farmland around the world. And even before we started to do research, local research with communities, with affected communities in Brazil, we knew two things. We knew that when you set up a large fund to buy land, that already drives the price of land up. And that puts rural communities and small farmers at risk. And TAA is not just doing this in Brazil. Brazil and the US are two main places where this is happening. And in the case of Brazil, that is also the neo-colonial view of as if it was all empty land. But there are actually hundreds and hundreds of communities that have been living in those regions for several generations: indigenous, peasants, quilombola communities, which are the rural Afro-Brazilian communities, and but they don't have the paper, the title of the land, but they have the right to land because they have been living there for several generations. And the main region that TAA is targeting, not just TAA, but other financial corporations, and also Harvard Endowment Fund is another big player together with TAA. They're two main players in this process. They are targeting the Cerrado, which is the Brazilian savanna, which is the most biodiverse savanna in the world. And it's like an upside down forest because the savanna trees are relatively short, but the roots go on and on and on for many kilometers. And it's a very important source of underground water and where most of the river springs start in Brazil. So by destroying the savanna, they are also changing the rain cycles in the whole hemisphere. So again, we're not just talking about impact on local communities, but that has an impact all over the world in terms of climate change, the destruction of biodiversity, that of course has an impact on public health. So what we are doing currently is that we have a campaign here in the US, in Europe, and in Canada at several universities to demand that GA stops speculating with farmland. And we also work closely with the affected communities in Brazil that have been organizing to fight for land rights. And we also found out, based on our research and the legal work we do with grassroots lawyers in Brazil, that several of these titles are actually legal and they can be canceled because GA and other financial corporations, Harvard and other corporations, they set up a very complex set of subsidiaries to go around the law, the Brazilian law that limits foreign ownership of land. So they trade stocks amongst themselves, and it's difficult to figure out where the money comes from. But there is a recent decision from the Brazilian National Institute that was a result of an investigation, a petition we started with the public prosecutor's office that also shows that they constitute the same economic group. So although they hide, where they are, and they build several subsidiaries, they actually, the funding comes from GA. And this poses a risk for GA clients as well, because first of all, you don't have much of a choice. You don't even know that GA is buying this land in Brazil. It's, the kind of patrimonial property is a different type of private property because you don't actually own. The clients of GA don't actually own this land, but GA manages this capital that comes from labor here of professors and other workers here in the US. So it's very important to build solidarity. And also the last thing I want to say about this is that the expansion of monocropping plantations is a main cause of climate change. When we hear about the fires in the Amazon or the destruction of the Cerrado, what is causing is mainly the production of 4 commodities: beef, timber, sugar, and soy. So although the main objective of these financial corporations is control over land, in order to justify control over land, they promote the expansion of these monocropping plantations, and that is a main cause of climate change and environmental destruction. And that also destroys food production by local communities.
Wow, well, let's wrap up our part of the discussion on a slightly more heartening note, because the devastation is really quite overwhelming sometimes. But constantly, since the beginning of our conversation, Myza, we've been working through, which is to say we're kind of deep in the contradictions of global capitalism, whether we're going to call it global racial capitalism, which we should, which is all of capitalism, for those of you who don't know, or give it some other name. But by staying deep in the contradictions, we can see connections that otherwise might not be apparent. So you, for example, just ended your remarks by saying that the deferred compensation of workers in the United States is funding the dispossession of people in the South. So do we shrug our shoulders, or do we figure out ways to form solidarity, which does not mean simply to say, well, then I'll forego my retirement, but what can we build together? And so that makes me ask in general how we can draw connections between the practical insurgent work of the MST, of, for example, even in the context of COVID, of the farmers in India who have been protesting now for months and months and months, many of whom are part of the same extended faith community that is producing the oxygen that is helping save lives in the state of Delhi and elsewhere in that region of India. Via Campesina, I mean, obviously we can't talk about all of these, but I list them for the people who are listening so that if your curiosity is piqued, you might look into some of these as well. Or, for example, this is something that excited me a lot recently. There have been, as I suggested earlier, increasing settlements of people in the, constantly expanding edges of cities throughout the global South, who have been displaced because of these great dispossessions, because of climate change and coastal erosion, because of the scarcity of water in good quality and quantity, all of these things. And as people have relocated and established their lives anew, obviously people have had to build communities where there was not already adequate housing, education, and so on and so forth to welcome people. So one such community, and this is only one of thousands on the planet, is Canaan or Kanana, which is in Durban in South Africa. And it's part of the land occupation movement, which is very intense in Southern Africa, particularly, although not exclusively, in South Africa. And that community in Durban just celebrated its, I think, 15th year. And the community has, constantly built itself out with self-built housing, with a school. It's, I believe, called the Frans Fanon School, with many things. And it has been in very close solidarity with the MST, which has both sent seeds to enable the Kana farm to flourish, and also some, technical advice, which we know MST makes available, like the, Venceremos brigades and so forth from Cuba, make available to those who have need of such advice. And so at the Kanana, place, there are two flags flying, their flag and the MST flag. And it's just a really great example of solidarity and international solidarity. This work, however, brings to mind as well that people who are fighting to forge this solidarity are also constantly and everywhere confronting increased police and increased militarism, both of which, especially militarism, produce negative feedbacks that increase the fragility of the contemporary climate and provoke global warming and so forth. So with all of that, I wonder if you might have any final remarks before we take some questions about the kinds of solidarities that you see most exciting today, wherever they might stretch to, and what you think is to be done as we celebrate Marx's birthday today.
Yes, I think that that is, always the question, right? When we have this analysis, of course, the most important question is that what we can do, right? What can we do with from where we are? I think that it's important to have this broad view, this broad perspective of the context of where we are. It's important to have also historical context to understand, the processes. But I think wherever you are, it's important to find community. There are so many ways to organize at the local level through, community groups, through unions. For example, in the case of GAA, we're asking people to organize, to pass resolutions in the faculty senate. So there are different ways to organize. And I think it's important to build community and not to feel isolated in this moment, right? We're in this moment of a huge crisis and also facing a pandemic. How we find community and how to organize and build institutions and build movements that can sustain those organizing processes through time, something that we can sustain over time, and have a memory also, how we can build memory so we don't forget, where things started. Like how these communities that you just described have been building this process, and how it's important to document this and to remember this as well. And that is also huge challenges, and we need to build solidarity. Like you said, there are different forms of repression and violence, from direct violence, like killings of activists, direct repression, communities being displaced, but also, for example, fumigation by airplanes. Large agribusiness corporations, they fumigate pesticides from airplanes. This is this is like a chemical weapon that they use. So also I think another challenge, and that, for example, this is something the MST and Via Campesina are doing, is how we can diversify our sources of food and energy and work at the local level, but at the same time think of scale. For example, the MST is the largest producer of organic rice in Latin America. And that's the main challenge. And one of the things they have been doing, Via Campesina they have a strategy called peasant to peasant knowledge exchange, because these communities have had, for many generations, the knowledge of, how to protect their seeds, how to build ecological agricultural systems. And this is key. If we don't transform our agricultural systems, we're not going to deal with the environmental crisis that we face right now. So I think in the US and Europe, that is, usually public opinion likes local food, buying from local farmers, buying organic agriculture, but multinational corporations are still promoting the expansion of monocropping plantations in other countries. How we can build solidarity around that. And for example, with the Green New Deal now, how we can also pressure for policy that looks at the role of US corporations, agribusiness corporations around the world. And for example, another good example is how the MST now during the pandemic is distributing food, healthy food that they produce in urban communities that are suffering because of the pandemic. So there is a lot of solidarity that can be built also between rural and urban social movements. And also I think the indigenous movements play a key role right now. And it's important to build solidarity because, there are even UN reports that show that indigenous communities around the world are the ones protecting biodiversity. And of course, protecting biodiversity is key to prevent other pandemics and other environmental and health crises. So, I think that is a lot to do, but I think it's important not to feel isolated and not to think that it's just a matter of individual choice. And it's important to build movements, to build solidarity, and to build communities.
Well, great. Peter, would you like to roll some questions out? Thanks.
Thank you both for that, Mysa and Ruthie. There's a lot going on in the chat, some of which is not in the form of questions, but perhaps one can be gleaned from the comments of Cesar Barros and Mia White around this question of TIAA and university divestment. What more could be done in addition to that process of divestment? I mean, what would you consider, Mysa, to be direct action in this regard?
Well, I think that in addition to pressuring TIAA to stop targeting farmland, we need to call for the land to be returned to the communities, because this land was actually stolen from communities. This was a process of illegal land grabbing. In the case of Brazil, that used to be all public lands. And actually, through the work we have been doing with local communities, a local judge has canceled hundreds of titles, and now we are in the process of supporting the communities to organize, to pressure, for land rights, for collective land rights. So there is a struggle going on. So TIAA clients, individually or as institutions, not just direct clients, but in addition to faculty and staff, students can also organize to pressure universities as institutions to tell TIAA to stop speculating with farmland, to return the land to the communities, and also to pay compensation for environmental and social damages that they have caused. So these are the main demands.
Just some clarification on that. So that would basically be what, a reform of TIAA, right? So it wouldn't be, for instance, I don't know, something closer to abolition, where you nationalize teacher insurance and take it away from private capital investment processes.
Yeah, that's a great question, because of course, stopping speculating with farmland is not going to mean that TIAA is not investing in other harmful businesses. So I think on the broad picture is how to transform a retirement system that is now based on financial markets into something that is a public system, similar to the discussion about healthcare, right? Because if we want to have stability in the future, which is, a pension should have, a retirement fund, you should expect stability in the future. But if this system is based on financial markets that are totally unstable, and it's paying the huge fees for the managers of these private corporations. So if we build public retirement funds, I think that it would be what would actually be in the long term what would resolve this issue, not having retirement funds be controlled by financial markets and speculation.
Francesca asks, can you say a little bit more about the technical aspects of agribusiness, the production of debt? What kinds of debt and for whom?
Yes, the process, for example, I'm going to give you an example. Before the economic crisis, before 2008, the average interest rate in Brazil was 7%. And agribusiness corporations were getting credit at 3% interest rate. So they were getting that funding and speculating in financial markets. And then they lost, after the economic crisis, they lost just in the currency market, they lost about $4 billion. So, you know, they received subsidized credit, speculated in financial markets, and had the loss of $4 billion. And then right after that, they received another $4 billion in new credit from the government. And, you know, I'm giving this example about how, you know, the green, Brazil was supposed to be what was called the Saudi Arabia of ethanol. And that was how sugarcane corporations were operating at that time, creating that. But I have done this calculation in the 80s, in the 90s, and now, you know, in the more recent years. So, you know, I have done this calculation over time. You just need to find the numbers to understand that. So they're actually, and another example is that right after the economic crisis, the price of agricultural commodities started to go down in financial markets. There was a new trend because we have these cycles of speculation. You know, the commodity boom started after the collapse of the NASDAQ market in 2001. After that, the collapse of the .com market, we saw this boom of commodities that lasted until 2008, right? So after that, the collapse of that, then we see this new boom of farmland. So we see this bubbles of financial capital that you know, destroy a certain sector of the economy and then migrate to a different sector of the economy. So what we realized at that time was that although the price of agricultural commodities was going down, the price of land continued to increase. So there was a disconnection between the production of commodities and the price of land. So that's why, you know, the conclusion is that the main objective of those financial corporations was control over land. But they had to produce something in the land to promote expansion of agricultural commodities in order to justify control over land. So, you know, land, the discussion about land today is central to capitalism, to the role of financial capital, which determines the production process today.
We have several new questions. The first that I notice is from Omega Hartman. How effective have the Brazilian courts been in upholding collective land rights and enforcing their decisions?
Yeah, it is a big struggle, of course, now with the Bolsonaro the Bolsonaro regime, right? For example, because of this legal petition and this investigation by the public prosecutor's office in Brazil, the National Land Institute has determined that all titles acquired by GA and Harvard should be canceled because they violate this law that limits foreign ownership of land. But that is an administrative decision that needs to be carried on. And of course, now the National Land Institute is controlled by the Bolsonaro administration. So it's a struggle. We also work at the local level, at the state level. For example, we are also working with communities to pass a legislation at the state level in the state of Piauí, which is one of the places where this is happening, to recognize collective land rights, not only for indigenous communities, but for other peasant communities, because Brazil has a very diversified rural population, that there are different types of peasantry in Brazil, and the law should recognize their rights as well, the same way that, we also have applied, for example, the same, we have supported indigenous organizations and build solidarity between indigenous organizations, peasant organizations, and Quilombola, which is the Afro-Brazilian organizations. So they claim the same collective rights for the land. So there are several strategies at the local, national level, but also we would not be able to do this to be successful if we didn't have international solidarity, if we didn't build a coalition in the US, Canada, and Europe to support these communities, because they face violence all the time on a regular basis. But if they know that the international community is in solidarity with them, this represents, concretely, it represents protection for them.
And I would like to add something here. And it's something that Mythri has said, but maybe bears being said even more explicitly, that there is no solution to the problems outlined in the couple of hours we will have been together today if we don't think structurally, i.e. we can't fix the problem of dispossession in Brazil and not fix the problem of dispossession on the planet, right? Whether we're talking about Palestine or South Africa or Black farmers in Mississippi or everybody who is dispossessed of their wages through wage theft in the United States and so forth. This is all one thing. So to come back to something that Peter said in talking about the pension question. I think Peter, it was either you or somebody in the chat, Peter, said, are we talking about divestment or are we talking about abolition? We are talking about abolition, actually. We're talking about undoing these relations by doing something else, that abolition is presence, not absence. It's not scorched earth, it's something else. And so the question for us is, and I mean the entire us on the 9 pages of this little conference today, is how are campaigns moving in the direction to relieve people of organized abandonment and the organized violence that reinforces the capacity of TIAA-CREF or whatever bank or Bitcoin or Archer Midland Daniel to do what they do. And so I just want to say that explicitly, that these campaigns have to happen, but they have to happen with a horizon that understands that the Brazilian courts, the US courts, the International Criminal Court, none of these bodies is able to solve the problem, because these bodies came into being in the context of organized violence and organized abandonment, and therefore tend to enable the reproduction of the very system requiring inequality that capitalism is. So it is really all about land. And I want to remind everybody who knows and tell people who don't know that in the States, indigenous collective called the Red Nation has produced a fantastic small D development plan called the Red Deal that everybody should read and think about. And the private ownership of land has got to be the first thing that goes. Not the last thing, but the first thing, because of all of these things that we're talking about today. Okay, Peter.
Let me see. I think Nancy Roma has a couple of questions about the practice of activism vis-a-vis TIAA. And the questions are, is there an effort to reach out to the national professional organizations, something like the American Anthropological Association convening over the summer, to get resolutions and action committees advanced at that level? And then a second and related question, is anyone keeping a database of all the TIAA members who are engaged or want to be engaged in the TIAA land grabs effort, so we can figure out where there are pockets of interest and therefore potential organizing nodes? So that's a kind of practical organizing questions.
Yeah, we have been working with the American Anthropological Association, with the geographers, the sociologists. So there are several resolutions also that have passed. We have been working there was just a resolution at University of Iowa. It was important because TA sent the CEO of its subsidiary to convince the faculty senate at Iowa not to pass the resolution. There is also organizing at CUNY, the union. The environmental group within the union is organizing and just also passed the resolution. That is organizing at CUNY, at the New School, at Harvard, at several universities. And we have monthly meetings of people organizing at universities, staff, faculty, and students. And we have a common collective website. It's called stoplandgrabs.com. And people can get involved. We have a toolkit with suggestions about how to organize. We have a petition on the website and lots of materials, reports. So maybe we can have that, like Ruthie suggested, post some resources online on the CPCP website later for people to get involved.
Yeah, I think actually, Mysa, some folks have been posting links of that kind as you've been talking this morning. A question from Fernanda Vidal. Agricultural production now is heavily technical, and in Brazil, students, even in public universities, have been trained for agribusiness forms of agriculture. So one issue that rural movements have to act about or on is on this question of education, and how can we promote an education that supports environmental practices? They used to act in two ways: by creating their own training in MST schools or centers of education, or by partnering with individual professors at universities to try and create small spaces for other forms of technical training. So how do you see this process in the United States? What is the role of universities in this process here?
Yeah, I think the role of universities is key, of course, right? Because this, the concept of agribusiness was created at Harvard University in 1957, after a book was published that there called The Concept of Agribusiness. And that was very influential in terms of public policy in the US and all over the world. So there was a real strong effort to promote this system all over the world, you know, through that process. And then, of course, the so-called Green Revolution. So, you know, we need to undo all of that. And it takes a lot of effort from social movements. Of course, the MST and Via Campesina have done a lot. They have their own schools, their own agroecology schools, nationally and internationally. They have partnered with several universities around the world. And also, I think that's why this is a key question for us to bring here in the US. You know, other organizations are working on this, the Rural Coalition, the National family farm coalition in the US, because we cannot have a productive agricultural system if we destroy the soil, the water sources, and biodiversity. So, you know, the type of industrial agriculture that we have today is only viable because it receives lots of subsidies. Why? You know, organic food is more expensive. It doesn't make any sense. You know, if industrial agriculture requires much more capital for machinery, for chemical inputs that are based on fossil fuels. So it's just, you know, it's a matter of policy and, of course, ideology and education. So yeah, it's very important to expand knowledge about this. And campesinos have their knowledge, so it's not like, you know, something that we don't know about, but how we talk about scale in terms of really transforming our food systems, which is key to deal with the environmental crisis.
I'd like to add, if I may, something that Mythri said a while ago in her remarks, and that is that of the food that's produced on the planet, 70% is produced by small producers. So we already have a disconnect between the fact of you know, capitalization, technical innovation, all of those things, and the fact of how the effort of muscle and brain that goes into the production of food, whatever it is organized. And that fact, as fragile as it might be, as something to stand on, is the most important, I think, fact we have. 70% on a world scale are small producers. And Via Campesina in particular, MST, other organizations, people organizing in Indonesia, for example, in Southeast Asia, have been sort of building on this fact to undo the devastation that monocropping, whether the crops that Mythri listed or things like palm oil. I mean, anybody who's been in Southeast Asia knows the endlessness of palm oil plantations is trying to work through. And I want to say now, and this is something else that we can put in resources on our webpage, that if we had had a full in-person conference with lots of speakers and a lot of interaction, the conference would have included people who've been thinking about this stuff a lot historically and in the present. And I want to name them. They include Kanishka Gunawardena, who's just written a fantastic paper on two Sri Lankan political economists, SBD De Silva and GVS De Silva, people who've taken the small d development thinking in the mid-20th century to a fantastic level, and whose work we should return to. Judy Hahn, who's done a lot of work on evangelism, and one of our seminar members this year, Dominic Betzel, also works on evangelism, which gives us some insight into what sorts of organization exists in a good deal of the rural world and how that might be mobilized or remobilized toward the goal of achieving the kinds of transformations we talk about here. Brenna Bandar, who has worked on the colonialism and capitalism and land, private property and land. Utsa Patnaik would have given us a very challenging and probably debate-worthy keynote to talk about these things. The artist Cameron Rowland, Boa Munjani, who has been working with Via Campesina and a number of movements for a long time, and then the artist Felipe Cesar, and our former postdoc, the historian of education, Sonia Vashburg, who do a lot of work on Guinea-Bissau, and Cabo Verde. So tiny countries, as tiny as Brazil is enormous. So this gives you all a sense, just a list, but a sense of the kind of stretch we intended our conference to have, and maybe we'll be able to do it sometime, should the future be returned to us in real life.
There's an implied question from the chat that has to do with your great question, Mysa, about what is the business of agribusiness, right? And as somebody who is an expert in capitalist critique, you give us a brilliant answer, right? Debt and finance, right? Not actually agriculture per se. This reminds me also of General Motors in the first decade of this century, who made more money through GMAC, through its financing division, than it did through actually selling cars. So given that, how can we relate the activism that you've been talking about, Mysa, around land grabbing to the infrastructure, as it were, of financialization in the current period? Because clearly from what you're saying, they're symbiotic, but they would require different forms of activism, no?
Yeah, I think we need to identify the main players, right? Because there are main players in this process. So who are the main players, understand the process and build movements around that. And also it's important what you said, make it clear. It's the same with agribusiness. It's difficult to separate what is productive capital and what is financial capital. So, some people debate, oh, productive capital is good, but financial capital is bad. But they actually, they're mixed together. So understand that process and how these processes are operate and how to target the main players that are causing destruction and displacement. And at the same time, what Ruthie was saying about, who is actually producing food and what type of production is actually invisible and does not show in any type of economic data. For example, if you visit rural communities in Brazil, even the agricultural census sometimes does not have that data, because small farmers usually say, oh, I produce corn over there. But then when you look around, there are vegetables, fruit trees, small animals. So there is a huge amount of production, of local production, that is not counted anywhere. But that is what sustains local communities in rural areas and small towns all over the world. And so that's why we need to also challenge this official numbers, the GDP and all of that agribusiness promotes. So, and we can also make a parallel with the invisible labor of women, right? And how in capitalism. So, so I think that, yeah, the key is to challenge, those mainstream concepts. And in order to do that, we need to understand how they operate. So, that's why it's important to study I'm a geographer, but I had to study political economy to understand all of this. And that's why social movements also, have a very sophisticated education system like the MSc Via Campesina to be able to understand those broad issues.
It's funny, I teach literature and my students always worry when I start with political economy, but you have to. My son, another question from Omega Hartman. this is about references, I guess. Are there any studies that we could go to about the land grabbing in industrialized countries by, for instance, sovereign funds? Can you think of anything offhand?
Well, there is a lot. Yeah, there's a whole group of people and organizations, scholars that have been doing work about this. So I think I'd rather maybe think about this and post information later.
Sure,
I'm not able
sure.
to read all the questions in the chat, actually. So yes, I think we can provide that information later.
There's a quick question here from Ina Velitu. How do you answer to an allegation of populism? I'm not sure how that works within the type of activism that you're talking about, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think depends on, people understand populism in so many different ways, right? So I think the word populism was, you can relate that with some policies in the 50s, you know, based on Keynesian type of economic approaches, or you know, some people refer it to, you know, right-wing regimes. Other people use that to create stereotypes about, you know, left-wing progressive governments. So I don't know, maybe Ruthie can help me clarify that, because I think you have to define what you mean, because the word is used in different ways.
Well, sure. Let me see if I can help. I mean, we actually had several weeks of conversation in our seminar trying to sort through fascism, populism, the particular variant of populism that my old mentor, Stuart Hall, called authoritarian populism. I don't know if he coined the term, but that's where I learned it. And so forth. And one of the sort of key features of the difficulty of talking about what we're talking about has to do with the ongoing hangover that many people have that was sort of produced in all kinds of media, popular literature, and so forth, that sort of suggests that somehow there's something called peasants or the working class who are the enemy of freedom, that they are, you know, the populists in the bad sense, that they are the, you know, their tendency is toward fascism. This is not true, but it's what many of us have been taught. So then the question is, how do we kind of sort through the sorts of struggles that people are engaged in, both in the United States and around the world, in order to see what the various tendencies are and how they might be resolved? Now, I'll give you some examples. In the Copper Belt in sort of southern and east central Africa, a very big place, there is constant struggle over who will benefit from the extraction of copper from beneath the surface of the earth. So the question is not so much whether the copper should stay in the earth, but rather under what kinds of relations it should be taken out of the earth, and then who benefits from the sale of that copper. Now, all of us who are looking at and listening to each other right now have some copper from somewhere enabling this dialogue. It's in your machine, either it's from DRC or it's from Chile, it's from somewhere. i.e., this conflict over this mineral has everything to do with how we are able to communicate today. So a resolution of the struggle might be called, let's not use the word populist, it might be called nationalism. we might talk in terms of resource nationalism. That need not be tending toward fascism. It could be a way to secure the capacity for self-determination for the people whose resource is currently being fought over, whether the resource is land or copper or cobalt or lithium in Bolivia. Therefore, the key question that is facing everybody now all the time is a permanent contradiction that we're constantly fighting out, and fighting out in a variety of ways. And that is the contradiction between self-determination, people in some kind of territorially demarcated polity being able to say, under these conditions, these are the kinds of conditions under which we want to reproduce ourselves and therefore how we want to produce. So self-determination. And then the questions of open borders, which have to do with good things as well as not so good things. Capital can move in, but also people can move around. So that sort of central or fundamental contradiction is one that we're constantly working through. And so something like the Red Deal gives us a way to look at thinking through this contradiction from the ground up in a way that doesn't resolve as populism that tends toward fascism. And yet in other places, the intensity through which various kinds of people wish to tighten the polity does tend toward fascism. But in Brazil, that's from the top down. It's not from the bottom up. In many places, it's from the top down, not from the bottom up, no matter what kinds of discourse the top uses to justify the kinds of dispossession and so forth. And I want to say one other thing about that, which is, which goes all the way back to the question that somebody asked about the Brazilian courts. And that reminds me of title. One of the difficulties that I see is unrolling on a global scale, unevenly in various jurisdictions and territories, but on a global scale, is the resort to putting title on land, i.e. privatizing land that had not previously been privatized. And in many cases, the intention is what, from my point of view, would be a good one. It's to help peasants, help people who otherwise would be dispossessed, be able to prove that they have a right to be where they are and to do what they do with the land. However, the form under which a good deal of land becomes entitled makes it then alienable, which means to say saleable, which breaks up communally available land or collectively used land, like the Ejistos in Mexico that were broken up as a result of NAFTA. And so the resolution that seems to be leading toward greater stability and security through title is actually undermining the very kind of security that people who had been using the land without title want to be able to secure and reproduce. So, you know, these are just some of the issues that come up. And there are people who are waging campaigns in places like Jamaica and in Brazil and in South Africa and in Mozambique and so on and so forth over these kinds of issues. So it's not like it's something that only a couple of people with PhDs at the CUNY Graduate Center have thought about. We're learning this from the ground.
Ruthie, we're almost at the top of the hour. Do either you or Mysa have any closing remarks to round out this get together, which has been incredibly interesting for me and provocative?
Yeah, I just want to say that this is very important, what Ruthie just said, because that's exactly what we are doing in Brazil. We are supporting communities to have collective land rights, not individual titles of land, because that makes them more vulnerable, of course. And this is also a struggle against, for example, the World Bank that is financing, for example, the privatization of agrarian reform communities in Brazil. The World Bank said that agrarian reform communities to be emancipated, they use these words, to actually privatize, because in the agrarian reform communities, the land remains public, but you know, the communities have the right to land. So yes, I think this is a very important point to clarify, and thank you so much for this space. It's wonderful. Thank you all.
Sure, I've so enjoyed this conversation, Mysa. I've been looking forward to it ever since we dreamed it up, and happy to have such a wonderful and lively audience to talk through these issues. I'll leave people with a thought that abolitionists share all the time, and that is what we must keep in the front of our minds as we conceptualize campaigns and then fight them through is to make sure we don't come up with a solution that's the thing we're going to be trying to bust down the day after we win. That the solution should be opening somewhere. So let's go back to the pension question. The pension question, obviously, to me, should be, the resolution of the pension question should be public pension. There should not be any of this private investment pension. But that means that not only do we have to fight for that, but it means that we who fight for a public pension have also got to be fighting for living wage and all of the related aspects of we who are dependent on cash income to be able to reproduce ourselves, and the kind of social reproduction that makes possible. Is we've got to see these things as a single continuous set of struggles that then we cut into wherever we can, however we can. All right, so thank you all. This has been an amazing, amazing year. Thank you, Mary Taylor, for making this whole thing happen. None of us is tech savvy, and Mary has taken that on her shoulders, and I'm so grateful. Congratulations, Mary, for publishing your book. Congratulations, Mysa, for all of the work you have done. Congratulations, Mythri, on getting some publications out in this time of such incredible stress and strain. And thank you, Peter Hitchcock, for being my friend and co-subthug. Thank you all for coming, and I hope we'll see you again sometime.